So take your Bible and turn to the book of Jeremiah. We're in chapter 46 tonight. I need to do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you look at the schedule in the syllabus, the schedule says that we will have class next Monday night, the 21st. And I guess at the time that I was putting the schedule together, it didn't occur to me that that's Thanksgiving week. And not only will a lot of folks be busy getting ready for Thanksgiving, although that is early in the week, but some of us will actually be traveling that day. And so there will be no class next week. Now, I do intend to have class on the 28th, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving. But next week is scheduled for a review of the book of Jeremiah, and we have moved along at a little bit faster clip than we had, than was scheduled. And so we will get to chapter 52 and some review of Jeremiah tonight. So no class next week, but I do plan to resume on the 28th. That's the day that I will be coming back in from being gone for several days. So it's possible I may have to send you an email that afternoon saying we'll have to defer it another week, but I don't plan for that to happen. Right now, the plan is no class next week, and we'll resume 2 weeks from tonight. So that being said, let's pick up at Jeremiah chapter 46. And here we come into a section of Jeremiah that is different than basically all the rest of Jeremiah's writings, because here the focus of Jeremiah's prophecies is not Judah. Pretty much all the rest of Jeremiah's work is focused on Judah. And as we've pointed out before, more for Ezekiel than for Jeremiah, but Jeremiah had to deal with it too. The captives, particularly that Ezekiel dealt with, objected to his message on the basis that, well, this nation and this nation and that nation and that nation, they're worse than we are. So God would somehow be unjust if he punished Judah before he punished those people. In their thinking, for God to be just, he had to start at the top, you might say, with the absolute worst people on earth, and then work his way down in terms of dealing out punishment. And in their thinking, then Judah, they're somewhere way down here, way down on the list in line for punishment. And they're just shocked at the idea that God would begin with them. But of course, one of the aspects that they refuse to consider is they were without excuse, because God had not just revealed himself to them, but given them his written law, which he had not given to anybody else. So they were without excuse, where the other nations around them, the Gentile nations, while they're not excused for their idolatry, they are ignorant in their idolatry. Israel, Judah, could not plead ignorance in their idolatry. In chapters 46 to 51, Jeremiah is going to turn his attention primarily from Judah to all of the surrounding nations that the Jews and the rulers keep pointing at and saying, but they're worse, but they're worse. And he's going to give prophecy, give judgment from God on those foreign nations. So that's where we are tonight. Now, some of the revelations that are given here are not dated. It doesn't say in the such and such a year of King thus and so, this is what the Lord said. Some of them are. It seems that it's pretty safe to assume that they appear more or less in chronological order. So we start then in chapter 46 with Egypt, and go from Egypt to the Philistines, to Moab, to Ammon, to Edom, to the Assyrians or Damascus, and then to Kedar and Hazor and Elam and so forth, just going more or less in order around the compass, that is around the surrounding nations of Judah. The exception to that chronological order might be that the prophecy against the Philistines in chapter 47 Jeremiah mentions that it was given before Pharaoh smote Gaza. Well, there's two problems, or two possibilities, really, not a problem, but two possibilities there. Possibility number one is that the Pharaoh who smote Gaza, which is the Gaza Strip that still exists today, that might have been Pharaoh Necho. And that would date this to about the year 609, 610, 612 BC, roughly the end of the 7th century BC. That's when Pharaoh Necho led his army out of Egypt, up across the Sinai Peninsula, up through the territory of the Philistines, right along the border of Judah, and was headed to Carchemish to meet the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, the outcome of that was that Nebuchadnezzar broke the Egyptian army's power, and they retreated into Egypt and were never really any appreciable military power or military player again after that. That's the time frame where King Josiah, the last godly king of Judah, goes out at age 39 to meet Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I'm not fighting with you. You're not a problem for me. Of course, what Pharaoh probably had in mind was for the Israelites to become tributaries to the Egyptians, and they did, but not under Josiah. Josiah insists on going out to meet the Egyptian army and is killed in battle. And that's the end of Josiah. The other possibility for the time frame when this could have happened, because in chapter 47, Jeremiah doesn't specify which Pharaoh he's talking about. He just says Pharaoh in the Hebrew text. The other possibility is that this would be some years later, and the Pharaoh that he's referring to would be Pharaoh Hophra, who is actually Necho's grandson. And that would push the date down to about somewhere between 589 and 570. So you got about a 20-year window in there where that could fit, because Hophra was on the throne in Egypt during that time. And that's the time during which the remnants of the children of Judah run away to Egypt. And of course, they don't prosper there. Jeremiah told them, don't go, and they went anyway. But that's also the time when Pharaoh Hophra was sort of flexing his muscles a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Babylonians. They'd gone back to Babylon. They'd taken the Israelites back, or the Jews back with them. And so Babylonian power in the territory of Gaza and Palestine, the promised land, was not tremendously on display during that time. That would date it sometime after the fall of Jerusalem and after the deportation of the Jews. Most Bible commentators seem to identify this Pharaoh with Necho, which puts it in Josiah's time, rather than with Pharaoh Hophra, which would put it in Zedekiah's time. Keil and Delitzsch, the German commentators, well-known, lengthy multi-volume commentary on the Old Testament, very detailed analysis of the Hebrew language and so forth. Keil and Delitzsch date this to Pharaoh Hophra, but they're kind of the outlier, kind of the exception rather than the rule. So there's really no reason for us not to take these prophecies as being pretty much in chronological order, with the possible exception of the Philistines, where Pharaoh assaults them. God uses Pharaoh. But it does no violence to the text to put them in chronological order, even if that's not the order that they actually occurred in. The order is insignificant. The fact that these nations were punished is the outstanding point. Now, take your Bible for just a moment and go back to Jeremiah chapter 1, to the very beginning where God commissions Jeremiah. And notice in chapter 1, you begin at verse 4, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, or came before me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you I appointed you a prophet to the nations. So these chapters 46 through 51 serve as a fulfillment of that statement in Jeremiah chapter 1, that this man, this priest, sequestered for the most part in and around Jerusalem, nevertheless would deliver God's word, not just concerning his own people, but concerning all the nations around as well. These prophecies stand in contrast to much of what Jeremiah says about Judah in this respect. When God sends Jeremiah word about Judah, no matter how bad it is, no matter how intense, no matter how focused, no matter how much it emphasizes God's anger, God's righteous wrath, one characteristic about the prophecies of Judah that stands out is that Jeremiah almost always emphasizes God will preserve Judah. God will leave a remnant. There will always be some of his people. He's not going to wipe them out completely. And that's because of his promise to David. That's because of his purpose in selecting the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. And that is to provide a pipeline, a conduit into the world for the Savior. So he has a much larger purpose at work all along than just setting these people aside as their own separate nation and his own special people. They don't see that most of the time. They don't appreciate it. They don't recognize it. You come down to the first century, to the time of Jesus, and the rulers of the Jews, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, they would have argued vociferously that that's not God's purpose, that God chose them because he loves them, that they're the most bestest preferred people of all people on earth. And numerous prophets in the Old Testament said exactly the opposite. Y'all are nobody special, and you're here because you serve God's purpose. Well, as we look at these prophecies, Egypt, Philistines, Moab, Ammon, Edom, and so forth, what stands out is that in these cases, God does, through Jeremiah, prophesy utter destruction, just total demolition of these nations. Now, we can look at the map today, and if you pull out a map of the Middle East, you look at the northeast corner of the continent of Africa, and what do you see? Well, there's Egypt. Egypt still exists as a nation, but just like you look across the Sinai Peninsula and up a little bit to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Ocean, and what do you see there? You see this little country called Israel. Just as modern day Israel is not biblical Israel, modern day Egypt, likewise, is not biblical Egypt. It's the same territory, it's the same ground. One might say it's the same dirt, and in some respects, it's the same people, descendants of the same people, but the nation is not the same nation. So God promises utter destruction, no hope for national restoration. Now, Egypt had already been, just by way of example, Egypt had already been through numerous cycles of their government being overthrown and their dynasties being wiped out and new dynasties arising. In fact, in the days of Joseph, when Joseph was in Egypt, those who were ruling Egypt, the Pharaoh that he served, was not actually even an Egyptian, but rather he was an invader. And those so-called Hyksos rulers, or invader kings, shepherd kings, who were actually rather obnoxious to the native Egyptians, they ruled for several generations before the Egyptians rose up in the days of Joseph's children, basically, and threw them out and reinstituted an Egyptian on the throne. And that's when the Israelites became slaves. And they served in slavery in Egypt for 400 years before God brought them out. So Egypt had already had plenty of historical experience with their government being overthrown and their country being in turmoil and turned upside down. Well, what God prophesies here through Jeremiah is that the current dynasty, the dynasty of Pharaoh Necho and Pharaoh Hophra, that dynasty would be wiped out and replaced by another. And sure enough, it was. Now, in some cases, you look at the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites. Who are these people historically? These people are descendants of Abraham through Lot, and descendants of Abraham through Esau. They're related to the Israelites, to the Jews. And in those cases, God promises some of them will escape. Well, in the case of the Edomites, some of them needed to escape because they're not finished in history either. One of their descendants, a fellow by the name of Herod, is going to play an integral role in the first century in the life of Jesus, because Herod is going to be the ruler of Judea, the Roman province of Judea, at the time that Jesus is born. And it's Herod who will fulfill the prophecy of the slaughter of the innocent babies, Rachel weeping for her children, as Matthew references, in his effort to try to stamp out Jesus, to try to wipe out the Christ. God allows some of these nations that are descendants of Abraham to escape, and he cares for them, but he does not restore them as nations. There is no nation of Moab today. There is no Ammonite kingdom today. There is no nation of Edomites, or as they were known in the first century, Idumeans today, even though some of their descendants did survive. He does promise aid after their destruction to those who are in some way related to the Israelites. Now, why are these prophecies here? We have 6 chapters, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51, the last section basically of the book of Jeremiah, that are all these grim prophecies of devastation and destruction and suffering and justice against these heathen nations. Why are they here? Why does Jeremiah write these down so that the Jews can read them? Well, on one level, misery loves company. The Jews, whom Jeremiah spends 40 years warning, God's going to get you, God's going to punish you, you've crossed the line too many times, God is coming for you. Well, now he's here. And they've been objecting all this time. Oh no, those people are worse, those people are worse. We're not as bad as them, which is not to say we're not bad. They were. But in the midst of their devastation and suffering and deportation to captivity, they do see God finally lowering the boom, you might say, on the people that have encouraged their idolatry and the people who have taken advantage of them at every opportunity, people who have caused them problems. Their persecutors are finally going to be judged as they are being judged. And so there's sort of almost kind of a grim satisfaction for them. Well, we may have gotten a beating, we may have gotten a punishment from God, but well, at least they didn't get away with it. Sort of a grim hope for the Israelites, for the Jews rather. These prophecies demonstrate how God can use different circumstances to produce his will in the world. God rules in the kingdoms of men, Daniel said. No question about it, no bones, no ifs, ands, or buts. Every government that exists because God permits it. That's interesting to us in the 21st century, isn't it? Whether you love our current administration or despise it, our current administration, current Congress, current president, and so forth are in office. They are in power because God has empowered them. God has enabled them to occupy these roles. Now, the challenge for them is to rule righteously. But looking beyond our own borders, we can look to the drug culture in Mexico, or we can look to the brutal atheistic communism of China, or the brutally practically atheist, not officially, but functionally atheist rulership of the oligarchs in Russia. We look at history and see the rise and the fall of Nazism and communism and so forth. God did not necessarily approve of any of that. But all of those rulers ruled. All of those nations rose and fell and rose again because God permitted it to serve his purposes. And he has not clued us into all of his purposes. Now, one of the things that we might take out of that is there's a huge challenge for Christians to be more influential with our faith. Not just more influential, but specifically influential with our faith in the world around us. And in a world that resents righteousness, in an environment that resents morality without apology, that's a challenge, but no more than Jeremiah faced in his time. So, take your Bible and flip over to Jeremiah chapter 46, and let's begin with an examination of the oracle, the judgment concerning the Egyptians. Now, the first half of this chapter is a picture of Egypt being defeated. This is for Pharaoh Necho. So this dates this to the time of Josiah, roughly, or somewhere in the neighborhood of about 612 down to 607, roughly. There's about a 5 or 6 year window there. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the nations about Egypt, verse 2. Concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates at Carchemish, and which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Here's the message. All right, now this dates it down to Jehoiakim's reign. So now we're going to move down that range of dates to about 608, 607 BC. Prepare buckler and shield, advance for battle, harness the horses, mount, O horsemen. Take your stations with your helmets, polish your spears, put on your armor. Now, there's an interesting aspect to this, that instruction to the horsemen, because the Egyptians, much, much more than the Israelites or the Jews, the Egyptians fought on horseback, not as we would be familiar with in the American West, the Apaches and Comanches and so forth, but with cavalry like the Romans, and with chariots and horsemen. And this was something that was not familiar, or at least not familiar in terms of doing this, using these tools for the Israelites. They were always on the receiving end of that kind of technology, not on the using it end of the equation. So here, get ready for battle. Put on your armor. Why have I seen this? What's the purpose of this vision? Number one, look at verse 5. They are dismayed, have turned backward. Their warriors are beaten down, have fled in haste. They look not back. Terror on every side, declares the Lord. The swift cannot flee away, nor the warrior escape in the north. By the river Euphrates, they have stumbled and fallen. Now, you think about this. You look at the map. The Egyptians have traveled hundreds of miles out of Egyptian territory to get to Carchemish along the Euphrates River, and have been soundly defeated there. So this first picture of the Egyptian defeat is in verses 1 through 6. But notice at verse 7, who is this rising like the Nile, like rivers whose waters surge? Now that figure represents an annual event in the history of the Egyptian culture and world. The Nile River, basically every year, has an annual flood. When it rains upstream in Central Africa, much of the water percolates down through the watershed into the Nile River and flows. The Nile is an unusual river in that it flows south to north. It flows down out of Africa through Egypt and out to the Mediterranean Ocean, out to the Mediterranean Sea. The rising of the Nile every year for thousands of years was an event of great joy and celebration to the Egyptians, because what happened was that every year the flooding of the Nile would bring fresh new nutrients to the soil. It would wash down fresh soil that would bring fertilizer and so forth, natural fertilizer, that it would replenish their fields so that they could plant another crop. The Egyptians, unlike the Israelites and the Jews, the Egyptians were basically farmers and fishermen settled along the banks of the River Nile. They were not herdsmen. That's why when Joseph brings his family down to Egypt, the Pharaoh places them in Goshen, which is an area actually away from most of the Egyptian people, because people who handled herd animals, and particularly sheep, were hated by farmers like the Egyptians, because their sheep would eat right down to the bare dirt. They would devastate their crops. So there's no love lost there. And that's why when the Egyptians throw off these foreign rulers in Joseph's day, they put the Israelites into slavery. They're resented by the Egyptians. Well, who is this rising like the Nile, whose rivers, like rivers whose waters surge? That's something that's a familiar aspect of Egyptian life. They depended on the flooding of the Nile every year to replenish the soil and replenish the fields. In fact, they worshiped the Nile as one of their deities. The waters turning to blood in Moses' day, that was a slap, as it were, a strike against their worship of the Nile River, God demonstrating, I'm greater than your God, the Nile. Well, here, rising up like the Nile is not just a reference to an annual event in the natural world. It also is a metaphor for their attitude, their overly optimistic outlook. They took their army hundreds of miles out of their territory, out of their supply source, out of their supply chain. They marched hundreds of miles out to where they would have to forage just to provide for their army, as if to say, we're so numerous, so mighty, so powerful, we can just flow out over the land and overwhelm anybody that comes against us. And what happens? Even though they think of themselves as being like a river in flood stage, he said, I will rise, I will cover the earth, I will destroy cities and their inhabitants, verse 8. But in fact, what happens to them? Under the leadership of Pharaoh Necho, they've gone all this way to Carchemish on the Euphrates River. Along the way, they fought the Philistines. They fought the Jews. That's when Josiah was slain, back in 2 Kings chapter 23. And they're expecting to just wipe the floor, so to speak, with the Babylonians, just like a raging flood. But guess what? God is not going to let that happen. These are the people who had enslaved his people for 400 years. These are the people who, throughout the period of the judges, and especially throughout the period of the kings, have constantly tried to undermine God's people, constantly encourage them in unrighteousness, in ungodliness and idolatry, constantly caused them problems and tried to seduce them away from God in one way or another. And so God says, I have a different plan for y'all. You think you're going to just flood out and wipe away the Babylonians? The Babylonians are going to be a dam. You're going to bump into them, and they're going to turn you back. So, even after they were warned, Jeremiah warns them here. Now, how much did they hear? We don't know. But Jeremiah warns them, and they persist in doing exactly what they want to do. They're ignoring the word of God. They're ignoring the will of God. They're 20 years later, 17, 18 years later, King Zedekiah would be just like them. They expected only good. They never planned for what if. Christians ought to look for the good. We are God's people. We're God's chosen. We're the Israel of God, as Paul describes the church in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 16. That does not mean that we never have hard times and hardships and difficulties. We do. The old saying goes, into every life a little rain must fall. Well, Jesus says in Matthew 5 and verse 45, God causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, and we typically think of that in the context of blessings, and that probably is the context of that in that setting. But sometimes rain, too much of a good thing, is a flood. Well, here, these people expect only good from their gods. Never mind that their gods are figments of their imagination. God says, I'm going to flood you. You think you're like a flood? I'm going to flood you. I'm going to destroy you, your inhabitants, and so forth. Pick up at verse 9. Advance, O horses, rage, O chariots, let the warriors go out, men of Cush and Put, who handle the shield, men of Lud, skilled in handling the bow. So here we've got basically mercenaries or auxiliary troops for the Egyptians, Ethiopians that are supporting them, and others from even farther south, and perhaps from Arabia as well. And yet, notice what it says. That day, the day that they go out to battle, is a day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, a day to avenge himself on his foes. The sword shall devour and be sated and drink its fill of their blood, for the Lord God of hosts holds a sacrifice in the north country by the river Euphrates. So basically, Jeremiah pictures this defeat as God sacrificing the Egyptians to the Babylonians. This is a second picture of the defeat of the Egyptians, and the imagery here is vivid. They're going to be lost. They're going to be destroyed. Come down here at verse 11. Go up to Gilead and take balm, O virgin daughter of Egypt. In vain you have used many medicines. There is no healing for you. Now the Egyptians of that era were celebrated through the world for their supposedly advanced knowledge of medicine. Their advanced knowledge of medicine was sort of a two-edged sword. There was, honest to goodness, advanced understanding in that world of a lot of things, surgeries and so forth. It's amazing what they understood and could do. By the same token, these were the people that would put things like cow dung on open wounds. So it's sort of a two-edged sword in that respect. But in verse 11, the reference to the balm of Gilead, that's a figure that has to do with balm that is a healing agent. Take this, O virgin daughter of Egypt. In vain you've used many medicines. You haven't used the one medicine, that is reverence for God, that could actually do you any good. Of course, they are part of the people that Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1 when he says they pushed God out of their knowledge. They didn't want to know about God. They focused on their own gods. Go back to the book of Exodus, to the 10 plagues, and every one of those 10 plagues is a rejection or a humiliation of something that the Egyptians worshipped. Every one of them strikes at the heart of their various religions. And so there's no healing for you, he says. Come down here at verse 12. The nations have heard of your shame. The earth is full of your cry. Warrior has stumbled against warrior. They have both fallen together. From this point on, when you talk about the Egyptian army and the power of the Egyptians and lean on the Egyptians, that's a joke. They have no power. In Zedekiah's day, from roughly 597 down to 586, the 11 years that Zedekiah, the last king on the throne in Jerusalem, during his reign, the Egyptians are constantly encouraging him and encouraging his court and his nobles. You need to align with us. We'll help you. We'll support you. We'll back you up. And the reality is, Jeremiah tells them again and again, and he says it here, Egypt can't back you up. They don't have any strength. They're all talk and no substance. So you come to verse 13, and the second half of this chapter, from verse 13 to verse 26, is a second prophecy, a second oracle about Egypt. And here there are three basic points. Number one, Egypt is going to be invaded. They'll be overthrown in their own land. They've been defeated in a foreign land by the Babylonians, but their power is going to be broken. The word that the Lord spoke to Jeremiah the prophet about the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to strike the land of Egypt. So what's going to happen is that Nebuchadnezzar is finally going to have enough of the Egyptians meddling in his affairs, and he's going to come all the way 1,000 miles, all the way from Babylon through Judah and the Middle East, across the Sinai Peninsula, into Egypt proper, to Memphis and Tahpanhes, to the royal cities of the Egyptians. And he will dominate the Egyptians in their own land. So in verses 13 through 19, you have the certainty that God is going to bring Nebuchadnezzar there. Nebuchadnezzar is going to invade. Declare in Egypt, proclaim in Migdol, proclaim in Memphis and Tahpanhes, say, stand ready and be prepared, for the sword shall devour around you. Why are your mighty ones face down? They do not stand, because the Lord thrust them down. Here's the message from Jeremiah. It's not Nebuchadnezzar and his power that does this. It's God using Nebuchadnezzar. Now you think about this, if the Egyptians hear this, if they listen to this, what's Jeremiah saying? The God of the people you enslaved and the people that you have tried to manipulate, the God that you don't even recognize, is going to use a nation that's mightier than you to humble you, to bring you down. Get ready to bow down to the Babylonians. You can't resist them. You can't overcome them. Look at verse 17. Call the name of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, noisy one who lets the hour go by. He's all talk. As I live, declares the king, whose name is the Lord of hosts. Look at this. As I live, declares whom? The king, the Lord of hosts. Like Tabor among the mountains and Carmel by the sea, shall one come. Prepare yourselves baggage for exile, O inhabitants of Egypt, for Memphis shall become a waste, a ruin without inhabitant. So, first of all, in this second vision, or this second oracle, Jeremiah's first instruction is, look, God is sending the Babylonians all the way to your land this time. They're going to cover 400 or 500 miles farther than they had ever come before, all the way down into Egypt, and they're going to ransack and destroy the royal city of Memphis. You look at verses 20 through 26, and here are the consequences of the invasion. Here's what's going to happen. A beautiful heifer is Egypt, but a biting fly from the north has come upon her. Now, for those who grow up in the city and don't grow up around livestock, the understanding of this imagery is a little challenging. But if you've ever lived out in the country or been around farming and ranching, if you know anything at all about livestock, you would understand that when a horsefly, for example, starts biting on a horse or a cow or a person for that matter, it's quite painful. They're not going to just stand there and placidly take it. Now, cattle are generally pretty calm animals. In fact, we talk about somebody who has a very calm, patient temper, who doesn't get excited very easily. That person is sometimes described as phlegmatic, phlegmatic, phlegmatic. That description, don't be careful how you use that, because if they go look up the word, it actually means cow-like. Cattle are usually pretty calm. They don't get too excited. But you let a biting fly, a horsefly or a hornfly, something like that, start working on them, and boy, you will see them get excited. And you'll see a cow that you wouldn't think could run, much less jump, twist and jump and squirm and try to get rid of that biting fly with all of her might. Well, that's the image here, a beautiful heifer, a beautiful young cow, but a biting fly. Well, that's Nebuchadnezzar. That's the Babylonians. They've come from the north. Even her hired soldiers, that's the men from Cush or Ethiopia and Lud and Put. Even they are like fattened calves. Well, why do you fatten up a calf? The object of fattening a calf is for slaughter, so that you have nice marbled meat with a good percentage of fat to the meat. It's pleasant eating, good steak. That's the imagery here. They're fattened up like calves for the slaughter. They've turned and fled together. They did not stand. The day of their calamity has come upon them. Now, the time of their punishment, what's happening? The army of Pharaoh and his hired mercenaries, they've turned tail and run. They've been routed and run away in disarray. She makes a sound like a serpent gliding away. Her enemies march in force and come against her with axes like those who fell trees. They shall cut down her forest. What forest would that be? Well, it's a figure of speech for the Egyptians. They'll take away all of the prosperity and sources of prosperity. The idea of Egypt as a beautiful heifer also plays onto the aspect of their idolatrous worship. They worship many different idols and so-called gods, and one of the things was their cow god. Go back to the book of Exodus, and the murrain of cattle, the disease that God sent on their cattle was a slap at one of their gods. You may look like one of these. Remember the golden calves at Mount Sinai? Where had the Israelites learned that? In Egypt. So they're going to be put to shame, verse 24. She shall be delivered into the hand of a people from the north. So the Egyptians are going to be broken down. The consequences of the invasion are profound, and their idols can't save them. But notice at verse 25, here's the statement. The Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, said, I am bringing punishment upon Ammon of Thebes and Pharaoh and Egypt and her gods and her kings, upon Pharaoh and those who trust in him. Remember, the Egyptians, like so many ancient peoples, held that their pharaohs were gods incarnate, gods in human form. And God says, I'm going to show that's not the case. I will deliver them into the hand of those who seek their life, the hand of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and his officers. Afterward, Egypt shall be inhabited as in the days of old. So I'm not going to just utterly wipe out Egypt. There will still be land there. There will still be people there. And here we are in the 21st century. It's one of the most populous nations of the Middle East. But it's not the same kingdom that it was then. But notice the conclusion here in verses 26 or 27 and 28. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, nor be dismayed, O Israel. Behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the hand of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. Now, in the immediate context, that's a contrast to what would happen to these Egyptians. These Judean captives, whether in captivity amongst the Babylonians or those who are in effective captivity later on amongst the Egyptians, that would be after the fall of Jerusalem, they will survive. They will manage to get by. God will take care of them. But notice the conclusion at verse 28. Do not fear, Jacob, my servant, declares the Lord, for I am with you. Now, pause and reflect on that statement in the context of Jeremiah telling these people again and again and again, God's going to punish you. You're going into Babylonian captivity and exile for 70 years. And when you do come back, it'll never be the same. And it wasn't. They didn't have a king. The temple was a poor copy. Most Jews never returned. Judaism was a different culture entirely when they did come back. I will make a full end of all the nations to which I have driven you, but of you I will not make a full end. So here's the consolation, bitter though it is for these people. I am with you. Boy, if you're with us, I'd hate to see what you're like if you're against us, because you're punishing us and you destroyed our nation. Yeah, because of your sin. But I am with you. I'm purifying you. I'm purging you so that I can bring you back. But I won't bring these other nations back. I will discipline you. Here's the key to all of this. I will discipline you, God speaking to Judah through Jeremiah, verse 28, in just measure. And I will by no means leave you unpunished. I'm going to give you exactly what you deserve. You're not going to get away with this. You're complaining, you're carrying on that these other people are worse than you. That doesn't cut the beans with me, God says, not in those words. That has nothing to do with what I'm going to do with you. So he starts this series of prophecies with the nation that arguably, until the Babylonians, had inflicted more injury, more hurt, had more brutally misused the Israelites than all the other nations combined, in a sense, because they'd been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. But it's like many of the older commentators have often observed, you can take the Israelites out of Egypt, but you never quite got Egypt out of the Israelites. They always tended to look back to Egypt, overlooking the fact that they were slaves there, but remembering, oh, it was good, it was easy, relatively speaking. They didn't have to be responsible in those days. Two oracles, two prophecies concerning Egypt. And they both say the same thing, basically. God is judging them, and God will punish them justly for what they've done. And as part of that, he's going to humiliate their gods. Now, come into chapter 47, and things are going to come much closer to home now. The focus is the Philistines. And if you look at a map of the promised land, and I think if I can get it out here, yes. You look at a map of the promised land. This is just a convenient way to do this. Here is basically the promised land, the territory of the 12 tribes, from the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. This side of the river primarily Manasseh and Gad and Reuben over here. But along the coast over here, from Tyre and Sidon up in the north, all the way down, you have the territory that belonged, for the most part, not to Israel, but to the Philistines, a Phoenician people, a seafaring people, although they seldom got out of sight of land. They just sailed up and down the coast, basically. But these people, with their 5 royal cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon and Gaza and Ekron and the one that I can never remember, these people were constant sources of trouble and problem, a constant ungodly influence to the Israelites. These are the people, the source of Delilah, for example. And these were the people that urged and encouraged idolatry. These are the people of Jezebel, the Sidonian princess who married King Ahab in the north and introduced the worship of Baal and the Asherah to the already idol-worshiping Israelites there. So here, the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh struck down Gaza. So this may actually predate chapter 46. We talked about that in the beginning. Thus says the Lord, behold, waters are rising out of the north and shall become an overflowing torrent. They shall overflow the land and all that fills it, the city and those who dwell in it. Men shall cry out, and every inhabitant of the land shall wail. So you have an image there of a flood doing huge damage to the point that people are crying out and wailing and carrying on because they can't do anything about it. It's interesting how often God uses, the Holy Spirit uses the imagery of water and flood water to describe impending punishment, because water will go through anywhere, whatever barrier you put up. A couple of weeks ago in the run up to Hurricane Nicole in Florida, just as with Hurricane Ian several weeks ago, people in the target area were filling sandbags and stacking up sandbags to try to keep the water out of their homes and their businesses and so forth. And that's effective to a degree. But even when you have a tightly woven dike of sandbags around your property, it's still going to leak. The ground inside is still going to be wet and sloppy. The purpose of the sandbags is not to keep it dry, but to keep the water from flowing in so rapidly that it floods. In this case, nothing stands in the way of God's flood. You can't stop it. Water will work its way in wherever it needs to go. And the sheer hydraulic pressure, the extraordinary power of water is one of the most powerful images on earth. Mobile Bay in South Alabama in the 1700s, 16 and 1700s, was the site of French explorers establishing colonies. And one of the reasons they chose Mobile Bay was because it was one of the finest natural harbors in the world at the time. But in the 1700s, a massive, massive hurricane struck. Of course, they didn't have AccuWeather, and so they didn't know it was coming, didn't know how big it was and so forth. but it struck at night, and what had been the western side, the western enclosure of the entrance to Mobile Bay, which goes out to Dauphin Island, basically washed away overnight. The protection of the harbor disappeared because of the storm surge. Now you think about this, is miles and miles and miles of peninsula that was just washed away, so that what had been a peninsula, Dauphin, became an island. That's the power of water. And here, as you look at chapter 47, that's the imagery that God uses for the Philistines. Now, an additional note, a little background to that. These folks are on the eastern shore, the far eastern extremity of the Mediterranean Sea. Again, in the map, this water is the far right-hand side, the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea, that end, the eastern end of it, is famous from antiquity for the fury and the violence of its winter storms. In the book of Acts, when Paul is being transferred from Caesarea Philippi to Rome, he advises this is not the time of year for us to sail, and the Roman who's in charge of him says we're going anyway, and they wind up shipwrecked because they set sail in the fall going into the stormy season, and they encountered what's called a Euroclydon. Basically, it amounts to a hurricane in a teapot. The Mediterranean is not that big an ocean. So you have this extraordinarily violent storm. Well, people living along that eastern shore would be exposed to the fury of those storms and water surging up onto the beaches, much higher than normal, and doing tremendous damage. So the waters are rising, but in this case, it's not the waters of the Mediterranean from the west. The waters are rising from the north. And water here is a figure for the enemies of these people that God will use to punish them. Every inhabitant of the land shall wail. All the noise of the stamping of the hooves of the stallions, the rushing of his chariots, the rumbling of their wheels. Now get the imagery here. The fathers look not back to their children, so feeble are their hands. In other words, what's coming is so frightening, so violent, so terrifying that a father doesn't even look back to try to bring his children along. He's too busy running for his own life. It's an attitude of, it's so intense. It's devil take the hindmost. You don't want to be the last guy in line because the bad guy's going to get you. I don't have to outrun everybody. I just have to outrun you. That kind of attitude. Well, that day that is coming to destroy all the Philistines, to cut off from Tyre and Sidon every helper that remains, for the Lord is destroying the Philistines, the remnant of the coastland of Caphtor. So you have the imagery of an overflowing stream or a coming flood, but it's not coming from the sea, and it's not flooding coming down out of the mountains along a river or a stream. It's the stream of the Babylonians coming against them to destroy them. And in verses 5, 6, and 7, baldness has come upon Gaza, Ashkelon has perished. Remnant of the valley, how long will you gash yourselves? A reference to their idolatrous practices. You go back to is it 1 Kings chapter 18, and the contest on Mount Carmel between Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel's prophets of Baal. And what do the prophets of Baal and the Asherim do? They cut themselves and they leap and they squall and carry on. Well, that's what these people's worship consisted of, and their priests and so forth did this. The Lord is destroying them. How long will you gash yourselves? How long are you going to do these nonsense things rather than acknowledge the God of heaven? Again, that takes us to Romans chapter 1 in the last few verses. They refused to have God in their knowledge, so God gave them up. God let them have the consequences of their sin. And so what you see here is a devouring sword come upon them. No hope for them. How can it be quiet when the Lord has given it a charge? That is the sword of the Lord in verse 6. Against Ashkelon, against the seashore, he has appointed it. He's going to wipe these people out. And they were destroyed by the Babylonians. Again, the Babylonians become God's tool for justice, even though they themselves are hardly a just or fair people. Come into chapter 48, and now the focus is going to go across the land. They've looked south to Egypt, they've looked west to the Philistines and the shore. Now they're going to look east across the Jordan River to the territory of Moab. And remember, the Moabites and the Ammonites are kinfolks. They're descendants of Abraham, are actually descendants of Abraham's family through his nephew Lot. They are the result of his incestuous relationship with his two daughters. Concerning Moab, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, woe to Nebo, for it is laid waste. Kiriathaim is put to shame. It is taken. The fortress is put to shame and broken down. The renown of Moab is no more. So the great fortresses and things that they held on to as their sources of reinforcement, sources of strength, they have no strength at all. They have there's no help there for them. They'll be defeated. You look at chapter 48 here. God is going to show mercy even to these people, though. There's no hope in their reinforcements, in their fortifications. In Heshbon, they planned disaster against her. Let us cut her off from being a nation. You also, O madmen, shall be brought to silence. A voice, a cry from Horonaim, desolation and great destruction. Verse 3, Moab is destroyed. Her little ones have made a cry. All these references to the locations and so forth, these are the strongholds. These are the fortified cities. These are the places that they would go and think they'd be safe. Notice what it says, though, at verse 6. Flee, run away, save yourselves. You'll be like a juniper in the desert. In other words, if you run away, you'll survive. Where I grew up, what we call cedar trees are actually junipers. And they grow in the rocky, alkaline, calcium-laden soil of the Texas Hill Country in West Texas. And they can get quite large, but even when they do, they're basically giant bushes. They don't grow to be tall and waving trees like the pines here in Georgia, or big stately trees like oak trees. They're even when they're huge, they're big stunted bushes. And that's because they're growing in places in rocky soil, in dry settings where most other things can't survive. They are amazingly resilient, but you don't make much lumber from them, and you don't gather fruit from them and things like that. They're an odd tree in that respect. They're a giant bush. Well, here, you'll be like a juniper in the desert. If you run away, you'll be able to survive. But surviving and thriving are two very different things. There at verse 6, what Jeremiah is doing is giving them a prophecy of the impending destruction of Moab. Now, on the east side of the Jordan River, what's between the Jordan River and the Arabian desert? Not much. There are some pasture lands that extend for less than 50 miles from the river eastward, and then you're getting off into the sands of the desert. And so this is an area where the Moabites were pretty hemmed in between the Israelites on the west and the desert to their east and south. They don't have a lot of of places they can go to run away. If you do run away, you'll survive, barely. They were fierce people. They were constantly trying to take advantage, not just of Israel. They fought with the Ammonites, they fought with the Edomites, they fought with the Syrians and the Assyrians, and they fought against the Babylonians as well. They were a warlike people. They were descended from Lot, but they were most notable for just trying to take advantage of others. Now, God is still going to preserve some of them. If you'll run away, you'll survive, but he's not going to preserve their nation. Go on down here at verses 7 and 8, 9, and 10, and there's an exhortation here, an encouragement. Because you trusted in your works and your treasures, you also shall be taken. And Chemosh, that's their god. Remember that Manasseh offered sacrifices to Chemosh, even his Moloch, parallel god, even his own firstborn. Chemosh shall go into exile with his priests and his officials. In other words, I'm going to put an end to this idolatry nonsense. Give wings to Moab, verse 9, for she would fly away. Her cities shall become a desolation. Cursed is he, verse 10, who does the work of the Lord with slackness, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from bloodshed. So you've got a statement there that in verse 7, the key to their downfall was their attitude. They were very self-possessed, self-centered. They thought about their abilities and their might, and they trusted in themselves, not in God. And because of that, God is going to bring them down. Now you go over to Revelation chapter 3 and you find the same thing in the Laodicean church, which emphasizes that this can be very much a problem for Christians as much as anybody else. But these people were blind to God's will. They had made their materialism, they'd made their material wealth their God, like many people in our generation have. And that was leading to their destruction. Think about, and I know nothing about the religion of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest men in our generation. By all accounts, apparently a pretty humble, ordinary kind of guy, but worth literally hundreds of billions of dollars. What could that buy him in eternity? Jesus answers the question for us in Matthew 16, verse 26. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? With all of his wealth, Warren Buffett doesn't have anything that God needs. He can't buy his way into heaven. These people were focused on accumulating, gathering, enriching themselves above all else. And now that's going to come back on them because it does them no good. They can't buy their way out of this problem. So you pick up at verse 11 and go down to verse 17. Moab has been at ease from his youth and has settled on his dregs. He has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into exile. The imagery here is that these people have taken advantage of their opportunities, but they've taken advantage of other people in doing that. They've never had to, never focused on honest work. They've never focused on being honorable in the sight of God. They've only focused on taking care of themselves. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I shall send to him pourers who shall pour him and empty his vessels. They've been gathering and gathering. This imagery of not having emptied from vessel to vessel. They haven't washed out the containers, so to speak. They just keep adding. Go to the cupboard, go to the cabinet. It depends on what part of the country you grow up in. Take a glass, clean glass, pour some milk in it. Drink that down. or pour it out, whatever. Go back to the refrigerator and pour some orange juice in it and drink that or pour it out. Go back to the refrigerator and pour some tea in it. Empty that out. Pour some more milk in it. Pour some grape juice in it. Go to the coffee pot, pour some coffee in it. Just keep doing this, adding to it, never rinsing it out, never cleaning it. Just keep adding to it. What do you get? Let it sit out on the counter for a while in between pourings so that the residue begins to dry. If it's milk, it begins to sour. Then pour something else into it. Get some water, clean, fresh water, and put it in that glass. Do you want to drink it? That's the imagery here of Moab not emptying the vessel, not pouring out the dregs. They've settled on the dregs. The imagery is they're so greedy, so self-focused, so bent on gathering and accumulating that they can't even bear to throw out the trash, so to speak. They can't even bear to rinse out the cup for fear that they might lose something, even if it's just a tiny bit, that they would consider valuable. And so what that does is it contaminates them. It becomes a stumbling block to them. Come down here, and in verses 11 through 17, Jeremiah is explaining what's happening to them, what's going on. Verse 14, how do you say we are heroes and mighty men of war? The destroyer of Moab and his cities has come up, and the choicest of his young men have gone down to slaughter. So your enemy, Nebuchadnezzar, has come to you. The Babylonians have come to you, and you've sent your best troops, the flower of your youth, down to fight against them. You've prided yourself on all your accomplishments, on your riches and so forth. Now, what's it come to? Now you're being wiped out. You're losing the flower of your youth, as it were. And Moab's destruction, the interesting thing here, is described in the present tense. It's described as if this oracle is being given while it's actually happening, even though it had not at the time that Jeremiah is saying this. But it's an accomplished fact in God's mind. God, who is not restricted to time, sees the end from the beginning. He sees the finished process, and he's describing it in real time, even though that real time has not yet arrived for those who are going to be involved in it. The point is that God describes this in terms so sure, so certain, that it's already occurred. Even though it hasn't happened yet, God has already determined that it has already occurred. He's already prepared this in his mind. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 23, Peter talks about the sacrifice of Jesus, the pardon me, the killing or the execution of Jesus, if you want to call it that. It was his offering in reality. But notice what he says in verse 23, that Jesus was delivered up, was handed over to these people by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Judas planned to betray Jesus. The chief priests paid him 30 pieces of silver. When he came and said, "What did you pay me to hand him over to you?" The chief priests had been seeking some way to kill Jesus. They wanted to put Jesus out of their misery because they were afraid he'd get more popular than they were, and they'd lose their position with the Romans. All of these things happened not because of Judas or the jealousy of the rulers or anything of the sort. It was according to God's plan, the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. So as we talk about the Moabites here in verses 11 through 17, Jeremiah is explaining to these people how these things can happen because God has ordained them. God has already seen them happen, so to speak. At verse 17, at verse 16, the calamity of Moab is at hand. His affliction hastens swiftly. It's coming on you now. Grieve for him, all you who are around him, all who know his name. The Israelites would have no love lost for the Moabites. They despised them. They hated them. They fought with them. They'd been oppressed by them. They had oppressed them in turn. The Moabites were idol worshipers. The Israelites were too, but didn't see themselves that way. And yet, even though there's justice in what's about to happen to the Moabites, grieve for him, all you who are around him. Jews, Ammonites, Edomites, the remnants of the Syrians and the Assyrians. Grieve for him. They had been a powerful nation, and now they're going to be basically wiped out as a nation. A few of the people will survive, but the nation will not. So you pick up then at verses 18 through 28, which takes us through the middle section of the chapter, basically. And what's pictured here is Moab being completely degraded, Moab being just totally humiliated. Come down from your glory, sit on the parched ground. O inhabitant of Dibon, for the destroyer of Moab has come up against you. Stand by the way and watch, verse 19. O inhabitant of Aroer, ask of him who flees and her who escapes, what has happened? Moab is put to shame. It is broken. Wail and cry. Tell it beside the Arnon, that's the brook that runs through Moab, that Moab is laid waste. Judgment has come upon the tableland. And you have mention of all of these cities that are part of the territory of the Moabites. In verse 26, make him drunk because he magnified himself against the Lord, so that Moab shall wallow in his vomit. And the idea here has nothing to do with any beneficial aspect of drinking, but rather force feed him, so to speak, force feed Moab drink until he vomits it back up. Was not Israel a derision to you? Was he found among thieves, that whenever you spoke of him, you wagged your head? So there's some schadenfreude is not the right term really here, but there's some poetic justice. Moab had celebrated when the 10 tribes were taken captive by the Assyrians. And now the point is, you're getting your comeuppance and you're getting what you deserve. The things that you said about the Israelites that Moab said were not true necessarily. The allegations and the false claims and charges, those were not true, but they're true about you. Leave the cities, dwell in the rock, O inhabitant of Moab. Be like the dove that nests in the sides of the mouth of a gorge. So you're just going to go out and find whatever shelter you can. At verse 29, we've heard of the pride of Moab. He's very proud. Well, that takes us into the next section. And Moab's letter, you might say, would be G for greed. You look at this is the second reason. The first problem was their pride, their arrogance. That's why they're being brought down. The second reason that goes hand in hand with it was their greed, their trust in material things. And so they're proud about their place in the world, and they're proud of their wealth and their possessions, kind of like the Edomites were in the book of Obadiah. They failed to realize that these things put them at odds with God. And these are people, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites particularly, are people who are without excuse for not knowing God, because they're related to Israel. Now it's 20 past 7. It's actually a little past time to take a break. Questions or comments, observations before we do? Well, then we'll take about 15 minutes, be back about 7:35, and we'll continue on with our prophecies against these heathen nations. All right. We are in Jeremiah chapter 48, talking about the extensive prophecy of destruction of Moab. And we had just noticed that they would be completely degraded in verses 18 through 28. Now come to verses 29 and 30. And here is the exaltation of those who rejoice at Moab's downfall. We have heard of the pride of Moab. He's very proud, his loftiness, his pride, his arrogance, the haughtiness of his heart. I know his insolence, declares the Lord. His boasts are false. His deeds are false. In other words, Moab's estimate of themselves, their opinion of themselves, had no basis in fact. They thought more highly than they should have. And so at verses 31 to 38, you have this lamentation for their bitterness, this lamentation for their what happens to them. Therefore I wail for Moab. I cry out for all Moab, for the men of Kir Hareseth. I mourn for more than Jazer, and so forth. All of these things. You reached out, your summer fruits, your grapes, the destroyer has fallen. Notice down here at verse 34, from the outcry at Heshbon, even to Elealeh, as far as Yahaz, they utter their voice. And so we have all of these boundaries, and the point of the reference points here, the cities, the towns, the areas, it encompasses the whole land of Moab. At verse 36, therefore my heart moans for Moab like a flute, and my heart moans like a flute for the men of Kir Hareseth. Therefore the riches they've gained have perished. And then you have this imagery of mourning. Their heads are shaved, their beards are cut off, the hands are gashed, sackcloth around the waist. All of these things that are images of suffering, of lamentation. And notice at the end of verse 38, on all the housetops of Moab and all the squares, there's nothing but lamentation. For I have broken Moab like a vessel for which no one cares. Here's the stinger, as it were. God has punished them, and nobody else mourns for them. They were a people that nobody would feel sorry for because of the way that they had behaved toward everyone else in their times of trouble. And so there is no escape for them in verses 39 through 46. Verse 40, thus says the Lord, behold, one shall fly swiftly like an eagle, spread his wings against Moab. The city shall be taken, the strongholds seized. The heart of the warriors of Moab shall in that day be like the heart of a woman in her birth pains, just paralyzed, basically. He who flees from the terror, verse 44, shall fall into a pit. He who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in a snare. There's no getting away from God's judgment, no escape. But look at verse 47. Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord. Thus far is the judgment on Moab. Well, how would God restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days? Who would the Moabites be in the latter days? The remnants of Moab pardon me, I walked out where it was cooler and now my sinuses are acting up. The remnants of Moab would likely be incorporated into some of the peoples who would become the Samaritans, intermingled with them. And God would offer to the Samaritans the word of the gospel. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, I'm a little confused. Earlier it said if they flee, they would not be they would survive. Now it's saying there is no flee.
Yeah, those who resist, there's no flight, there's no escape. Now, go back to that statement earlier on. If you flee, you'll be like a juniper in the desert, basically. That's bare survival. That's not total destruction. Moab is not destined for utter obliteration because they are part of Abraham's heritage, as it were. They were descendants of Lot. They'll survive like a juniper bush in the desert, so to speak, get by. But their problem has been that they have lifted themselves up in their own eyes. They have been insolent and thought more highly than they should. And here, the emphasis is, for the sake of the covenant with Abraham, God will preserve some of them, but they're not going to be preserved in their current state where they think too highly of themselves, where they think they're better than everybody else and they can raise themselves up by their own bootstraps, that kind of thing. Now you come into chapter 49, and a short little chapter here, or short little section rather, verses 1 through 6 is focused on Ammon. The Ammonites are siblings to the Moabites, and their crime is stated right off the bat in verse 1. Has Israel no sons? Has he no heir? Why then has Milcom dispossessed Gad, and his people settled in its cities? Ammon's crime was that they had taken advantage of the Israelites to steal their inheritance, basically. They had pushed over into Israelite territory. Therefore, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will cause the battle cry to be heard against Rabbah of the Ammonites. It shall become a desolate mound. They'll be conquered. They'll be overthrown. Wail, O Heshbon, for Ai is laid waste. Cry out, O daughters of Rabbah. Why do you boast of your valleys? Verse 4, O faithless daughter, who has trusted in her treasures, saying, who shall come against me? I will bring terror upon you. You can't fight God, in other words, verse 5. But notice verse 6. Just like with Moab, afterward, I will restore the fortunes of the Ammonites. God takes care of his people, even though they have to be corrected and even punished. Now, go back and look at chapter 49, verses 1 and following. And here, concerning the Ammonites, thus says the Lord, does Israel have no sons? The commonly accepted principle of inheritance in the ancient day is that when an individual dies having an estate, that estate would pass to the nearest of kin. We sometimes describe this as the law of primogeniture. The firstborn son gets the lion's share, becomes the next patriarch, and so forth. In Ruth chapter 4, when Boaz redeemed Ruth from a nearer kinsman, there was somebody who was more closely related to Ruth's late husband and to Naomi's late husband than Boaz was. Boaz had to sacrifice his inheritance in order to obtain Ruth and the inheritance that went with her. When national Israel was carried away into captivity in 721 by the Assyrians and destroyed as a nation, who would their nearest kinsman be? Well, that would be Judah, the remnants of the same nation. But what happened is that Ammon, who's a distant relative, Ammon invaded some of Israel's territory to take it over for themselves. Now, Malcolm, depends on the translation you're reading from. Some say M-A-L, some say M-I-L. If it's Malcolm with an A, it refers to the king of Ammon. Some of the newer translations, as in the English Standard here, you have Milcom. That's a reference to the god of the Ammonites. Now, the connection between the two is that the king would be identified with the god of the Ammonites. Either way, though, the point is the same. They had violated the customs of the day, the laws of the day. They shoved their way in to seize an inheritance that they did not have the first claim on. Judah had the first claim, so to speak, and Ammon just pushed their way in and took what they wanted. And that, for that reason, then, they are to be punished. They had taken an unfair advantage of the situation. Now you go down to verse 7, and in chapter 49, verse 7, down to verse 22, you have a judgment against Edom. And it's interesting that we go from the Egyptians on the south to the Philistines on the west, and then we go through all of these neighbors on the east and the southeast who are kinfolks: Moab, Ammon, and Edom. Concerning the Lord of hosts, concerning Edom, thus says the Lord of hosts, is wisdom no more in Teman? Has counsel perished from the prudent? Has their wisdom vanished? Now, the reference to Teman takes us back to the book of Job. One of Job's friends, Eliphaz, if memory serves me, was from this area. Eliphaz the Temanite, from this territory. And he had come a long way to commune and commiserate with Job. But he goes on here in this prophecy against the Edomites. Calamity is coming, and it cannot be escaped. They cannot get away from it. Thus says the Lord, verse 12, if those who did not deserve to drink the cup must drink it, will you go unpunished? You shall not go unpunished, but you must drink. For I have sworn by myself, declares the Lord, that Bozrah shall become a horror, a taunt, a waste, a curse. All her cities shall be perpetual wastes. Well, what's going on here? Esau had taken unfair advantage of others as well. Esau, Edomites, had made themselves famous, basically, in that ancient time for their materialism and for their arrogant trust in their own territory. If you remember the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the Harrison Ford film from back in the late 80s, early 90s, the area where they go, where there's a city cut into a wall of rock, is a real place in the Middle East. It's called Petra. And this is an area that in ancient times actually belonged to the Edomites. And that little rift valley there could be easily defended because the entry and exit to it were so narrow that you couldn't march an army in. So a few men could defend that valley. The Edomites thought of themselves as having basically an impregnable fortress there. And God says, I'll take care of your fortress. I'll hand you over. Jim, did you have a question or a comment? I thought I saw a hand raised. Okay, well, we'll move on then. Here, go back and look at verse 9. If grape gatherers came to you, why would they not leave gleaning? If thieves came by night, would they not destroy only enough for themselves? But I have stripped Esau bare. In other words, because of what they've done, God says, I'm going to clean them out. of everything that they hold dear, everything that they're trying to hold on to for themselves. The interesting thing here is that the judgment against Esau is ensured with an oath by God. God says something and that's a done deal. But when God swears an oath that he's going to do something, that's like double indemnity insurance. That's a double guarantee. And so you come over here and you look at the territory that's mentioned here, the vengeance of God here. There would be no excusing the Edomites' pride. Now, the whole little one-chapter book of Obadiah is focused on this same point as well. These people were arrogant in their outlook. They thought of themselves as above the law, so to speak. They thought that they could defend themselves against all comers. And the Babylonians, among others, are going to prove to them that they can't, because God is against them. The subsequent conditions here: I've heard a message from the Lord, verse 14, an envoy has been sent among the nations, gather yourselves together, come up against her, rise up for battle. In other words, God is gathering an army against Edom, against these people that think that they can stand against anybody. Verse 15, I will make you small among the nations, despised among mankind. The horror you inspire has deceived you. Come down to verse 17, Edom shall become a horror. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified and hiss or whistle because of all its disasters. And then there's this interesting comparison at verse 18 to Sodom and Gomorrah. When Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighboring cities were overthrown, says the Lord, no man shall dwell there, no man shall sojourn in her. I'm going to make you like Sodom and Gomorrah. Who is like me? Down here at verse 19, what shepherd can stand before me? God saying, you can't resist me. In verses 19 through 22, God is going to tell them exactly how he's going to do this, who he will use. Notice, who will summon me? What shepherd can stand before me? Hear the plan that the Lord has made against Edom and the purposes he has formed against the inhabitants of Teman. The little ones of the flock shall be dragged away. Their fold shall be appalled at their fate. At the sound of their fall, the earth shall tremble. The sound of their cry shall be heard at the Red Sea. Behold, one shall mount up, fly swiftly like an eagle, spread his wings against Bozrah, and the heart of the warriors of Edom shall be in that day like the heart of a woman in her birth pains. Again, that figure of basically paralysis almost. It's coming and you can't resist it. When a woman goes into labor, it's real labor, not Braxton Hicks contraction. There's no turning it back. The baby's going to come. Well, in this case, judgment is coming upon them. Go ahead, Brother Jim. You're still muted. Can't hear you.
All right. I'm going to do something here, something different. Sorry. Oh, this one. Okay. Okay. He's making all these predictions and talking about all these different nations that are going to fall. What is he doing with this information? Who is he giving it to?
Well, primarily, Jeremiah is delivering these judgments in the hearing of the Jews. In the immediate context of Jeremiah, the issue is what Ezekiel had dealt with the captives and what Jeremiah was hearing from King Zedekiah and his advisors and the false prophets like Shemaiah and Hananiah, who were their defense against Jeremiah's prophecies is, our God would be unjust to punish us before he punishes these people that we consider worse than us. And Jeremiah is delivering these prophecies to the Jews. Now, Do these go out to the various nations? I don't know. But they certainly go out amongst the Jewish people, and these prophecies emphasize that God has ordained judgment against these people. The fact that Judah is getting theirs before these nations come up for theirs, that's beside the point. That's Judah's whole contention, is God ought to punish them first, and maybe he'll quit being mad by the time he gets to us. Well, he's not going to quit being mad because you don't have any excuse. But you keep arguing it's not fair for him to punish us and not punish them. God's going to punish them. And that's what these prophecies show. God is dispensing justice against them. And so God has chosen someone to conquer them, and there's no resisting them. At verse 19, like a lion coming up from the jungle of the Jordan against a perennial pasture, I'll make him run away from her. You're not going to be able to get away from the judgment of God. Now you pick up at verse 23, and you have just this little short judgment against Damascus. Damascus was the historic capital of Syria, and the Syrians had in ancient times been foes of the Israelites. More recently, Damascus had been part of the territory of Israel, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. Of course, at this point, they're already in captivity. But this imagery of Damascus, this Hamath and Arpad, these are territories that pertain to that area. And this famous city, this famous area that had been a center of world power in previous centuries, even they don't escape judgment. The fact that they're no longer the dominant world power, that's got nothing to do with anything. Judgment comes for them too. Damascus has become feeble, verse 24. She turned to flee, and panic seized her. Anguish and sorrows have taken hold of her as of a woman in labor. You turn to run away, and where are you going to go? How are you going to get there? There's nowhere you can go. You have no ability. You're stymied at every turn. Her young men shall fall in her squares, soldiers be destroyed in that day, declares the Lord of hosts. I'll kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus. It shall devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad. Now, these are people who, at this point in time, Ben-Hadad is long gone. His empire has been consumed by the Assyrians, who have been consumed by the Babylonians. But just because that nation is gone doesn't mean that its evils, its injustices, its sins have been forgotten. And God will execute judgment on the people that remain, because he does not forget. You have a picture of consternation, of great concern, and of conflict here because of these people. Now you pick up at verse 28, and we go in the next half dozen verses or so through the territories, the city-states basically, of Kedar and Hazor, the kingdoms of Kedar and Hazor that Nebuchadnezzar struck down. Thus says the Lord. And this is the Lord's instruction to Nebuchadnezzar, basically. Arise, advance, destroy the people of the east. Their tents and their flocks shall be taken, their curtains, their goods, their camels. So these are the folks, basically, of the Arabian desert at this point. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has made a plan against you, verse 30, formed a purpose against you. Rise up and advance against a nation at ease. There's no escaping here for these people. Notice what he says down here at verse 33. Hazor shall become a haunt of jackals, an everlasting waste. No man shall dwell there. No man shall sojourn in her. Even these comparatively minor kingdoms, Bedouins maybe, even they come in for judgment. God does not overlook anybody. At verse 34, we have a judgment against Elam, the Elamites, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. So now we have a timestamp here we're down to about the year 597 at this point. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. Here's their doom coming upon them. I will bring upon Elam the four winds of the four quarters of heaven. They'll be surrounded, no direction they can go to escape. I will terrify Elam before their enemies, verse 37, bring disaster upon them in my fierce anger, send the sword after them until I have consumed them. I will set my throne in Elam and destroy their king and officials. But in the latter days, verse 39, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. So there's hope even for some of these heathen people, just as there is hope for Judah. Now, at chapter 50, Babylon takes center stage. And here's the people that the Israelites, in many ways, or the Jews more specifically, would be most concerned about, most focused on, because that's who is dominating them. They are the world power. They have already, at this point, they've already taken away a sizable portion of the Jewish population with Ezekiel in 597. And this prophecy at this point, this is very fresh for the Jews in Jerusalem, because those things have just happened. Nebuchadnezzar, he's just been there and gone and taken a lot of people with him. So concerning Babylon, concerning the land of the Chaldeans, declare among the nations and proclaim, set up a banner and proclaim, conceal it not, and say, Babylon is taken. Bel, that's one of their gods, is put to shame. Merodach, that's another of their gods, is dismayed. Her images are put to shame. Her idols are dismayed. Now, at the time that Jeremiah delivers this particular prophecy, Babylon is the mightiest empire that the world has ever seen. They have just, in one sense, come out of nowhere. They've been the handmaid. It's an ancient culture, but they've been the handmaid to the Assyrians for over 100 years, for generations. And now they've just, in a flash, they've overwhelmed the Assyrians and taken over. And they are the mightiest power the world has ever seen. And they're right in the flower, in the flourishing moment of their power when Jeremiah utters this prophecy. But notice the perspective in verse 2. Babylon is taken. Babylon has fallen. Babylon's gods have been humiliated. Out of the north, a nation has come against her, which shall make her land a desolation, and none shall dwell in it. Both man and beast shall flee away. Well, that's a reference to the Medo-Persians, who were a subject nation, or they were conquered nations under the Babylonians. And they're going to do to Babylon what Babylon had done to Assyria, and basically consume the empire from within. In those days, and at that time, declares the Lord, the people of Israel and the people of Judah shall come together, weeping as they come, and they shall seek the Lord their God. They shall ask the way to Zion with faces turned toward it, saying, Come, let us join ourselves to the Lord in an everlasting covenant that will never be forgotten. So when Babylon is consumed, that'll be the time that Israel and Judah come back together, at least in part, and seek the face of the Lord. Well, go back to the end of 2 Chronicles and notice, if you will, what Cyrus says in the decree that allows the Israelites, the Jews, to go home. In 2 Chronicles 36, beginning at verse 22, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, that it might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing. Here's the proclamation, verse 23. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, May the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. Cyrus allowed not just the Jews, but anybody of the 10 northern tribes as well, who wanted to be a part of this, to return to the promised land. And then you go to Ezra and Nehemiah, and you read in Ezra chapters 1, 2, and 3 about the return under Zerubbabel. And what do you find? Of the people who returned, about not quite 50,000 of them, 49,735, I think. You have Jews of the tribe of Judah. You have Benjaminites who had been lumped in with the tribe of Judah for hundreds of years. But you also have Levites and some of Manasseh and Ephraim and some of the other northern tribes who historically, some of them had cast their lot with Judah and not with Israel, because at least originally they had tried to remain faithful to God. Not the whole tribe, but isolated individuals and families. So in the fulfillment of that return, what has Jeremiah just told us? When that takes place, that's when Babylon shall have fallen. In that return, there is that fulfillment of prophecy. So, as we look at this, Babylon's destruction coincides with Judah's deliverance from captivity. When Babylon is destroyed, Judah will be set free. And that's, of course, that's what happens with Cyrus and the Medo-Persians. And that's the first 10 verses. Notice verse 6, he says, my people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds led them astray, turning them away on the mountains. From mountain to hill they've gone. They've forgotten their fold. All who found them have devoured them. So here's the root of Judah's problem. It's the leadership that led them away from God. But you get down here to verse 8, flee from the midst of Babylon, go out to the land of the Chaldeans, go out of the land of the Chaldeans, be as male goats before the flock, lead the way, in other words. If you know anything about sheep and goats, the rams lead the flock. They lead the way normally. I'm stirring up and bringing against Babylon a gathering of great nations, that's the Medo-Persians. Chaldea shall be plundered, verse 10. All who plunder her shall be sated, declares the Lord. They'll get everything they want. So you come down here, and in the next section, verses 11 through 20, Babylon is to be desolated, just demolished, and Israel or Judah will be restored. And that's the next section. Though you rejoice, though you exult, O plunderers of my heritage, though you frolic like a heifer in the pasture and neigh like stallions, your mother shall be utterly shamed. So remember how God has described Nebuchadnezzar previously. In carrying out the conquest of Judah, he is Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. But his people, his nation, goes far beyond what was necessary and brings themselves into condemnation. Now, here's the condemnation for their excesses. Raise a shout against her all around, verse 15. She has surrendered. Her bulwarks are fallen, her walls are thrown down. This is the vengeance of the Lord. Take vengeance on her. Do to her as she has done. So they get their comeuppance here. They get what they deserve. Notice in verse 17, Israel is a hunted sheep driven away by lions. First, the king of Assyria devoured him, and now at last Nebuchadnezzar has gnawed his bones. Therefore, I'm bringing punishment on the king of Babylon and his land as I punished the king of Assyria. God used Nebuchadnezzar to punish the Assyrians, and now he'll use Cyrus and the Medo-Persians to punish Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. At verses 21 through 28, you have Babylon's visitation, the coming of judgment against them. Go up against the land of Merathaim, against the inhabitants of Pekod, kill and devote them to destruction, declares the Lord. Do all that I have commanded you. Well, in fact, the overthrow of Babylon takes place overnight for the most part. But judgment is a slow process. And here, God's people will be vindicated. They'll be set free. It's interesting to notice that from the time of Cyrus's ascendance, the Jews seem to spread like wildfire all over the territories of the Medo-Persian Empire. They're not confined anymore to the precincts of Babylon, and they spread all over. They flee and escape from the land of Babylon, verse 28, to declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, vengeance for his temple. Israel is vindicated. Babylon finally gets their comeuppance, starting at verse 29, summon archers against Babylon, and Judah, or national Israel, not the 10 northern tribes, but the remnants, they are redeemed. At verse 33, the people of Israel are oppressed, the people of Judah with them. All who took them captive have held them fast. They refuse to let them go. Their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of hosts is his name. He will surely plead their cause, that he may give rest to the earth, but unrest to the inhabitants of Babylon. A sword against the Chaldeans, against the inhabitants of Babylon. So this is God's judgment. I'm sorry. Let that go to voicemail. In all of this, you have Babylon getting what they deserve. Now we're into chapter 50 in this, the latter part of the chapter, and there are four things that stand out in chapter 50 from verse 35 going into chapter 51. Number one, the destruction is thorough. The Babylonian superstructure, the Babylonian government, the Babylonian rulership, all of that is just completely swept away by the Medo-Persians, completely blotted out, verses 35 through 40. And in fact, if you think about it, let me flip a page to get to my notes here. In this prophecy against Babylon, Jeremiah mentions the sword of the Lord 5 times in 3 sentences. And each time it's a picture of God conquering some aspect of Babylonian society, the rulers, the braggers, their heroes, their military strength, chariots and horses, and their wealth. And they were the richest empire of the time. Remember the image, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had seen that Daniel interpreted: golden head, silver breastplate, or silver chest, and bronze belly or brass belly, and then legs of iron and feet of iron mingled with clay. And Daniel says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the golden head, but there's a bigger kingdom coming after you, silver kingdom, and a tougher kingdom coming after them. That is, after the Medo-Persians, and that would be the Greeks, Alexander, and somebody of iron, stronger still, the Romans coming after them. So here you have the sword of the Lord that is taking down each aspect, each strong point of the Babylonian Empire. Despite all of their qualities that hold them together and that support them, God is going to bring them down. You can't resist. You can't fight against God. It takes us back to what Gamaliel counseled the Jews in Acts chapter 5 and verse 39. Don't be found trying to fight God. Well, that's what these people ended up doing. They were his servants as long as they served his purpose, but they went way past his purpose and brought themselves in for destruction. So you pick up at verse 41 in chapter 50, and notice a people comes from the north, a mighty nation, many kings, stirring from the farthest parts of the earth. They lay hold of bow and spear, are cruel, have no mercy. The sound of them is like the roaring of the sea. And the imagery here is not of battle so much as it is they're irresistible. Their destruction of anybody who does stand in their way. And the Medo-Persians were tremendous warriors. In one respect, they were the backbone of the Babylonian army at one point. But the destruction, the fight on their behalf is ruthless. There's no standing against them. Look at verse 43 in chapter 50. The king of Babylon heard the report of them, and his hands fell helpless. Anguish seized him. Again, here's this image of a woman in labor. And you think about the book of Daniel, which depicts these events taking place. And what do we find in Daniel's record? Belshazzar, the king, the successor at that time, when he sees the handwriting on the wall, what happens? He's paralyzed with fear. And that very night, the Medo-Persians take over and he's deposed and disposed of. Come to the end of chapter 50. At verse 46, at the sound of the capture of Babylon, the earth shall tremble, and her cry shall be heard among the nations. The mightiest empire ever known up to that point is wiped away overnight. And that's astonishing to all the peoples that have been conquered and subjugated by it. So you come into chapter 51, the destruction of the empire is vividly depicted in these first few verses. I'll stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon, against the inhabitants of Lebkamai. Send to Babylon winnowers, and they shall winnow her. If you know anything about grain, you have to separate the grain from the chaff, and that's what's being pictured here. God is going to separate out all of the useless stuff from the good stuff. Let not the archer bend his bow. Let him not stand up in his armor. Spare not her young men, and so forth. Israel and Judah have not been forsaken, verse 5, by their God, the Lord of hosts, but the land of the Chaldeans is full of guilt against the Holy One of Israel. The Babylonians had gone far beyond what was necessary. When Jerusalem finally fell, the record says that the invading Babylonian soldiers, in some cases, were every bit as bloodthirsty as the Romans in 70 AD, that they slaughtered indiscriminately at that point. And judgment comes upon them because of that. So you come into verse 6, and here is an exhortation, but it's not to the Babylonians, it's actually to the Jews, to Israel, to the people of God that are there. Flee from the midst of Babylon. Let everyone save his life. Be not cut off in her punishment. This is the time of the Lord's vengeance. In other words, don't get in the way. When you see this, get out of the way. And Babylon has fallen and been broken, and don't be part of that. The Lord has brought about our vindication, verse 10. Let us declare in Zion the work of the Lord our God. Now remember the context of this. Jeremiah is foretelling. This is not going to happen in Jeremiah's lifetime, very likely. He'd have to live to be an old man, because he's older than Daniel by a good 25 or 30 years. So Jeremiah's not going to live to see these events himself. But he is foretelling these things. This is being written down so that when these things happen, where are the people's minds going to go? The Jews' minds. This is what Jeremiah talked about. Jeremiah foretold this. And they'll remember these things as they see the kingdom being overwhelmed. Get out of the way. And what is this happening prove? Well, this proves what Jeremiah was saying all those years ago, that God is preserving his people, that there is going to be a remnant. We are going to get to go home. So you get down here and verses 11 through 26, after warning the Jews, get out of the way, don't be caught up in this, don't be part of this destruction. Well then, we would have healed Babylon, but she was not healed. Forsake her, let us go each to his own country, verse 9. In other words, get out of Dodge. Don't get caught up in the destruction. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, verse 11, because his purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it. It's a divine destruction. It's God's judgment on these people. And the imagery here is vivid in chapter 51 down through the end of the chapter. This from verse 11 going forward: set a standard against the walls of Babylon, make the watch strong, set up watchmen, prepare ambushes. The Lord has planned and done what he spoke concerning the inhabitants of Babylon. It's a done deal in God's mind. It's a done deal from Jeremiah's point of view. The description here, and I know our time is escaping us a little bit. I do want to get to chapter 52. But the doom of Babylon here at the end of chapter 51, you pick up at verse 27, you have the attack going on here. Set a standard upon the earth, blow the trumpet among the nations, prepare for war against her, summon the kingdoms, Ararat, Mini, Ashkenaz, appointed marshal against her. All of these things, this is God bringing all these things to bear. The warriors of Babylon have ceased fighting, verse 30. They remain in their strongholds. Their strength has failed. There's nowhere they can turn. The daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor, verse 33. At the time when it's trodden, yet a little while, and the time of the harvest will come. Nebuchadnezzar the king has devoured me, crushed me, made me an empty vessel, swallowed me like a monster, filled his stomach with my delicacies, rinsed me out, passed me out. The violence done to me and my kinsmen shall be upon Babylon. Let the inhabitant of Zion say. So this is the complaint of Israel. This is the charge against the Babylonians. They went beyond what was necessary. Therefore, I'll plead your cause. I'll dry up her sea. Babylon shall become a heap of ruins. That's God's judgment against them down here at the end of this section at verse 37. Go over to verse 44. I will punish Bel in Babylon and take out of his mouth what he has swallowed. I'll redeem Israel and Judah out of Babylon and go out of the midst of her, my people. Let everyone save his life, at verse 45. Babylon is going to get retribution. Babylon is going to get judgment. And at this point, now remember, Jeremiah is looking down the stream of time to this. But when this takes place, then Judah's sentence will have been served, basically. Babylon must fall for the slain of Israel, verse 49, just as Babylon has fallen for the slain of all the earth. But then the final pronouncement against Babylon at verse 54, a cry from Babylon, the noise of great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. The Lord is laying Babylon waste and stilling her mighty voice. All of this is God judging these people. So you come to the end of chapter 51, and at verse 59, from verse 59 to the end of the chapter, this is the history of this prophecy. The word that Jeremiah the prophet commanded Sariah, the son of Neriah, the son of Maaseiah, when he went with Zedekiah, king of Judah, to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Sariah was the quartermaster. Jeremiah wrote in a book all the disaster that should come upon Babylon, all these words that are written concerning Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Sariah, when you come to Babylon, see that you read all these words and say, O Lord, you have said concerning this place that you will cut it off so that nothing shall dwell in it, neither man nor beast, and it shall be desolate forever. When you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it cast it into the midst of the Euphrates, and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Now, this reading would undoubtedly be done in public. This is for the people in captivity to hear and to see the symbolism of the book being thrown in the river, to understand this is a prophecy from God. Now, this is also speaks to the communication between the captives and the folks at home. But at the time that Jeremiah is writing this, Zedekiah has not yet been taken captive. Jerusalem is not yet fallen. There are captives in Babylon, but the end has not yet come. So this is all preparation for what is yet to come. And it addresses the fundamental objection of the Jews about God not punishing everybody else as well. Now, our time is up, so we'll stop here and we'll pick up chapter 52 and move over into Lamentations then 2 weeks from tonight. Not next week, but the 28th, Lord willing. Should be back, and we'll pick up that and move on from there. We've got just a minute or two left. Comments or questions before we call it a night? Jim, I see that yours or Sharon's phone is unmuted. Did you have something to say?
That's me. You know, I just I had some questions, but they basically were put to rest.
Okay.
What was Jeremiah's position amongst the Jews at this time? Was he?
The farther you go, pardon me, Jeremiah's work in Jerusalem basically falls into two sections. The first 17, 18 years that Josiah is still alive, Jeremiah is welcome and honored and moves freely and is in the palace. After Josiah dies, Jeremiah's fortunes take a dramatic turn for the worse, and he is unwelcome. He's assaulted. He's plotted against. He's publicly rebuked and accused of traitorous behavior and so forth. You know, we've talked about him being imprisoned and beaten and so forth. At the time that he's writing these prophecies, this is from primarily from the reign of Zedekiah, that last ungodly king. And so while the things he says in these prophecies would actually probably be welcome news to those Jews, Jeremiah is not a welcome face in most circumstances. We know that Zedekiah sneaks out to meet with him from time to time. Zedekiah is afraid of his own shadow, and he's afraid of his nobles more than he's afraid of God. But in providing these prophecies, really what Jeremiah is doing, what God is doing through Jeremiah, is laying down a series of markers, you might say, not so much for the people that would hear them or that would read them initially, as for the people who would then see these events taking place, playing out on the world stage. These are prophecies that, as time passes, they vindicate God to his people. His people have objected and argued ceaselessly up to the time of Jerusalem's destruction. Now, after destruction, when they're in captivity and they see these other nations being destroyed, they see captives coming in from the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites and the Philistines and the Egyptians even, and they hear the news of Babylon's conquests and Babylon's greatness and so forth. They'll be able to look at this and say, maybe Jeremiah was right after all. Of course, Jeremiah's not going to be there among them. He's going to wind up being carried away to Egypt. But these captives that are going to have knowledge of this are going to be able to point to this and say, Jeremiah said this would happen. And that's going to be particularly useful to someone like Ezekiel, whose whole second half of his prophetic life is devoted to trying to rebuild hope among the captives after Jerusalem has been destroyed. And when he can say, Jeremiah foretold that this would happen, and look, it's happening, Jeremiah told the truth, then that reinforces their opportunity and reinforces a reason for them to continue believing in God and taking God at his word. And you didn't ask for a 5-minute dissertation on that. Anyhow.
Thank you, anyhow.
That's kind of the context of this. It's preparation for what's to come.
Another good class. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, Jim. Anybody else? Observations, questions, comments? Well, we'll destroy Jerusalem next time, 2 weeks from tonight. And then we'll move on to what Jeremiah sees in the destruction of Jerusalem in the book of Lamentations. And Lamentations is a fascinating study, grim, but fascinating. And we'll stop there for tonight. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your participation.